You wrote an open letter to the Chancellor a week or so ago, and you commended her intellectual self-confidence and toughness while she worked for you. What are you going to be listening for on Wednesday that will demonstrate the presence of that intellectual self-confidence and toughness?
Well, clearly the main aim of the budget is to increase spending on public services financed by both higher borrowing and higher taxes. And I think the big challenge is to demonstrate that the amount she intends to borrow is compatible with a stable falling debt-to-income ratio at the end of this Parliament. The current fiscal rules don't make a lot of sense. They're based on, St Augustine's idea, make me stable, but not yet. But not even St Augustine asked God for a 5-year rolling horizon. So that will go, I think. But I think just to change the fiscal rules and pretend that means you can borrow more without thinking about the consequences for the amount of debt which our grandchildren will have to pay off, wouldn't make any sense. So I think the test for her is actually not to run away from the fact that she wants to borrow more, but to demonstrate how that higher borrowing in the short term is going to be constrained in the future as higher taxes come in, and that the economy will grow enough to ensure that the amount of debt that we have as a national debt relative to our national income will start to fall back.
You're inviting her to display a level of discipline not common amongst chancellors. What would be the sort of signal that you think would demonstrate that she's got a grip on that? I mean, they now surrounded themselves with all these institutions, the Office of Budget Responsibility, Bank of England's got independence. Now there's going to be a new thing called the Office for Value for Money. What is going to constrain her or any successor?
Well, what ultimately will constrain her is whether or not people, voters, feel that the higher taxes they are going to have to pay are worth paying in order to get better public services. So the government will have to deliver on better public services, which means a lot more than just giving money to them. It means reform. And I think the biggest test of this government will be whether it's willing to take on some of the special interests that will inevitably defend the status quo.
I want to come back to that, because actually you make this point in your letter. Just as a general point, we were just discussing with the panel there the extent to which the government appears to have boxed itself in by the pledge on national insurance, VAT and income tax. Was that unwise? Very unwise.
I think the previous government was irresponsible to cut national insurance contributions when that was only remotely feasible, given unrealistic projections for public spending. And I think the opposition didn't need to make a commitment not to reverse that. And honestly, I think that it would be much better now just to say to people, this is where we are, be completely straight with people, say, yeah, we made that pledge in the heat of an electoral battle. It was a mistake. We regret it. And we're going to unwind that. We're going to put the national insurance contributions back to where they were, because without that, we won't have the money to support the NHS and other public services. That would be an honest approach.
Sorry. Well, that's very interesting, because I spoke to the Education Secretary this morning, and she was not at all certain with me about whether that pledge was for the whole of the Parliament. Now, it may be that sometime today we'll hear from the government whether it is for the whole Parliament or not. What would your advice be to them this morning?
Well, I don't think you can make commitments on taxes for an entire Parliament. I mean, things change, unexpected events happen. We had the global pandemic. No one expected that back in 2019. We had the energy crisis. So I think to make promises which you can't realistically make doesn't make sense. The important thing is to have a narrative, a story which says this is what we're trying to do, and what we actually implement in practice is obviously going to be a response to various events. But I think more important than that is the fact that all this debate about not putting up taxes on working people is a terrible illusion, really. Taxes are paid by people. They're not paid by companies or institutions. Ultimately, they fall on the amount that people can spend. And you only can raise significant amounts of money by raising taxes on most people, however you care to define that. But it's most people will have to pay higher taxes. And if they, instead of unwinding the cuts in employees' national insurance contributions, put up employers' national insurance contributions, that will make it less likely that companies will accede to wage demands. They will press down on that. They will probably be less enthusiastic about creating new jobs. Ultimately, the impact of these higher taxes has to be on the consumption of most people, however you care to define that group. And I think it goes to another point, which the government ought to be, if they were sensible, they'd be absolutely straight and honest about it, which is to say, if we're going to invest more as a share of our national income, because we invest less than most other countries, that's a sensible objective. But if we're going to do that, we have to consume less as a share of our national income. And that means we have to save more. We save less than almost any other industrialised country as a share of our national income. And that suggests that the government ought to encourage saving for pensions and ultimately be very concerned to reduce budget deficits.
I don't want to tempt you into the political arena, but everything you say suggests that what you think is happening here is that this government, let's ignore what's happened in the past, is not being straight with the people.
Well, I think once you get stuck into a debate about what constitutes a working person, then you've lost the argument in effect. What you need to do is to say, we need to spend more on these public sector projects because they're important. People will understand that. And you can't finance that without either borrowing more or raising taxes. There's a balance between those two. If we raise taxes, you will end up having to bear the burden of that, but in return you get better public services. If we borrow too much, then our grandchildren will bear the burden of that through having to pay higher taxes to finance the interest on the debt that's taken out. So there's a balance here, but I think being completely open and honest about it is the only sensible way forward. And if I were helping the Chancellor to draft her budget speech, which I'm not, I would eliminate any references to the previous government altogether. We've heard enough about that. What she now needs to do is to say, this is where we are, this is the challenge facing the UK, we need better public services, that will require higher taxes, higher borrowing, but also reform. It won't be easy, it will take time, but that's a plan for the Parliament.
You refer to the impact of borrowing on future generations, but actually the impact of increased borrowing falls on people now. Do you think that the plans that we expect to see emerging may, I think you suggest, have an impact on interest rates and particularly mortgage interest rates now?
Well, it could do. It could do. Certainly, if you borrow more, it doesn't matter how you dress it up in terms of a different fiscal rule. People know that higher borrowing means higher borrowing. And financial markets and people who lend to the government will demand a slightly higher interest rate to compensate for the higher amount of debt that they're being asked to finance. It doesn't have to be dramatic, but it certainly will put some upward pressure on long-term interest rates. I don't think it necessarily affects what the Bank of England does today or even next year, but it certainly will have some upward pressure. But that's, if borrowing more makes sense, and that is justified in terms of do we want to invest in these public services, that's the political judgment, then we're prepared to pay the price of that.
So there's a danger here, but there is a danger here of mortgage rates maybe not being massively higher, but certainly being higher and for longer.
It's possible. I don't think we know for certain, and a lot depends on whether you've got a very short-term mortgage or a longer-term mortgage. It's longer-term interest rates that would bear the brunt of any higher borrowing. But I think the key thing, and this is the challenge, I think, for the Chancellor, is to explain why it makes sense to have higher borrowing for the next 2 or 3 years, but then to stop that process as we get to the end of the Parliament. Because otherwise, if our national debt just goes on rising faster than our national income, we will be in a difficult position.
Well, this is a very interesting point to me, anyway, that in your letter, you call on her to link investment, by which these days everybody means actually spending the public's money, to reforms in public services. And you mentioned teachers and so on. Was it right for her to spend, I think, something like 9 billion or so in public sector pay settlements?
Well, and that's not for me to judge. And I wasn't involved in the negotiations. I'm not close to that. And I can see why, if you want to give a career path for junior doctors to encourage them not to go abroad, certainly makes sense to help junior doctors. But those are political judgments that have to be made. And I think the essence of the budget is not to have too many phrases like a new fiscal rule or borrow to invest, but actually to talk about concrete measures to spend more where people can see the benefit of it. If the idea is to spend more on either building new hospitals or paying junior doctors more or having more equipment in hospitals, spell that out, because it's the merits of the spending that will determine whether or not people are willing to accept higher taxes in order to see the benefits.
So the rule for the speech on Wednesday would be keep it simple, keep it concrete.
Keep it simple, keep it concrete, and above all, keep it honest.
A lot of this is also about keeping the markets confident. I mean, that's what you've just said is perhaps for the public. The markets are watching the government's management of the economy. It's not always possible to please the market and the public, as I think we saw in the autumn of 22 with the quartering budget. Is Rachel Reeves, in your view, getting the mood music right? I mean, we've heard an awful lot about what's likely to be in this budget already.
Well, I'm not a fan of leaking what's in a budget in advance. My guess is there'll be one or two goodies that have been kept behind, particularly to please backbench MPs, which haven't been mentioned at all. That will be, the thing that she brings out in the budget. And I think there's a risk in trying to pretend that the impact on financial markets can be concealed by leaking things in advance, so the impact on markets occurs earlier, rather than referring to the reaction to the budget speech itself. I actually think that being clear, being concrete and being honest works both for the public and for the markets. Financial markets won't be fooled by a change in the fiscal rule. They will be interested in what does this mean for the total amount of borrowing that the government intends to make.
I'm not going to ask you to mark her homework in advance, but your expectation, do you expect to see, by the way, just any new big rabbit in the hat? Is something we're not paying attention to as a possibility?
Well, I have no idea, because if there is something like that, neither you nor I will know about it, so I can't. But I'm sure that one or two things have been held back, which will be good news, particularly to backbench Labour MPs.
By the way, do you remember her from working with her at the bank? What was she like?
She was very tough, intellectually very bright. She was a junior economist with a range of other junior economists. What she particularly enjoyed was working with them. She was forthright, a lot of self-confidence, but not arrogance, but just self-confidence. OK, well, we shall see what your former... I was going to say pupil, but not. No. Former colleague. Member of staff, colleague.
delivers on Wednesday. Lord King, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you.